Welcome to On This Day on the Grueling Truth Sports Network. I'm your host for On This Day, Mike Goodpaster, and today we're going to talk about On This Day, December the 30th, 1973, the Minnesota Vikings beat the Dallas Cowboys 27-10 to advance to Super Bowl VIII. Now, we're going to talk mainly about the 1973 Minnesota Vikings today, which were a great team. They came up a little bit short in Super Bowl VIII, actually a lot short in Super Bowl VIII, but it's a team that from 1973 to 1978 was one of the best teams in the NFL. And 1969, of course, they had played in Super Bowl IV, got upset by the Kansas City Chiefs. They brought in Fran Tarkenton from the New York Giants in 1972 and had a not particularly good season. They were missing some pieces, and one of the big pieces they were missing was a solid running game. They were kind of a piecemeal team from 69 through 73 or 72 with Oscar Reed, Dave Osborne, Bill Brown, solid running backs, but nobody really great. Nothing really to sustain an attack in an era where defensive-friendly passing rules made running the football imperative. I mean, this is a time where until the ball was in the air, you could basically do whatever you wanted to a wide receiver. Now, Minnesota rectified this by drafting a fullback named Chuck Foreman, who was a brilliant football player. He was a great blend of power and speed, and he rushed for 801 yards in 1973, winning the Offensive Rookie of the Year. Tarkenton still had a reliable receiver in John Gilliam, who was a big play wideout on the outside that could stretch the offense or defense. The offensive line was tolerable, though not great. Jan Yeri was still an outstanding right tackle, but the best of the rest was Mick Tingelhoff, who was a great player in the Pro Football Hall of Fame now, but he was on the downside of a great career. The defense had regressed in 1972, but it returned in 1973 to be one of the league's elite. The Purple People Eaters finished second in the league in points allowed. Carl Eller and Alan Page were first-team All-Pro up front, with Gary Larson and 36-year-old Jim Marshall, who both were competent players. Marshall was still pretty damn good at the ripe old age of 36, filling out the front four. Now, more improvement came in the back seven. Jeff Simon was a 23-year-old middle linebacker, and he made the Pro Bowl. So did veteran free safety and future Hall of Famer Paul Krause, and quarterback Bobby Bryant had a breakout year with 7 interceptions. Now, Minnesota opened the season at home with the Oakland Raiders, who would end up losing in the NFC Championship game by the same score that the Vikings won the NFC Championship game, 27-10, against that great Miami Dolphins team. Now, the Raiders, as I said, consistent playoff team through the 70s, and Tarkenton threw a 43-yard touchdown pass to Joe Gilliam to put the Vikings up 10-0 early. A special teams lapse, allowing a punt return for a touchdown, put Minnesota behind 16-10. But in the end, Minnesota was able to force 4 turnovers and win the game 24-16. 1 week later, the Vikings fell behind a terrible Chicago Bears team on the road 10-0, but turned it around and won 22-13, getting 5 field goals from good old Fred Cox, who was one of those straight-on kickers that we saw so much in the 60s and 70s. The biggest concern in the early going was rush defense. Both the Raiders and the Bears had run for 200 yards on a Minnesota defense that prided itself on being physical up front. The rush defense showed up for a trip to Green Bay. Green Bay, if you remember, was a team that had taken over the division the year before from the Minnesota Vikings. The Green Bay had went to the playoffs the year before and lost in the divisional playoffs to the Washington Redskins. Now, this was kind of a statement game for the Vikings at the time. Now, the Vikings would slip below 500 for the year by the time the year was done, but nobody knew that at the time. The Vikings intercepted 4 passes and dominated this game at the point of attack and ended up winning 11-3. Ed Marinaro was an occasionally used fullback who rushed for 83 yards in that win over Green Bay, and he was a weapon again the next week at Detroit's old Tiger Stadium. Tarkenton found the fullback on 2 first-quarter touchdown passes that set the tone in a 23-9 win. Minnesota followed up with 2 wins over subpar teams in the 49ers and the Eagles, and they won both of them. They didn't run the ball well in San Francisco, but forced 5 turnovers against an offense quarterbacked by the old ball coach, Steve Spurrier. He was in replacing the injured John Brody. Now, Gilliam starred in the win over Philly, running an end around for 1 touchdown and catching another one. The Vikings at this point were riding high at 6-0, as were the Los Angeles Rams in the NFC. Home field advantage was still determined on a rotation system rather than by merit like it is today. That changed in 1975. So the Vikings-Rams meeting in Minneapolis on October 28th didn't have the same meaning that it would today, but there was still a ton of pride on the line with these two teams that were contenders all through the late 60s and into the mid-80s. Minnesota ran for 182 yards. They held LA to just 86 on the ground and won 10-9. And more dominance in the running game led to a 26-3 win over the Cleveland Browns a week later. No one else in the NFC Central was seriously going to keep up with Minnesota, and any doubt about that was eliminated when the Vikings roundly drummed the Detroit Lions 28-7. Brown and Osborne conjured up the best memories of their recent past in rushing for 101 and 79 yards respectively. With a record of 9-0, an undefeated season was on the table for these Vikings just 1 year after Minnesota Vikings had completed a perfect season by winning Super Bowl VII. That all ended on a Monday night in Atlanta. The Falcons were a good team that year, and they finished 9-5 even though they missed the playoffs, and they would have made it under the more expanded format that we see today. Targeted threw a 39-yard touchdown pass to Gilliam, but there was no running game, and Atlanta's Dan Hampton ran for 108 yards to keep the Falcons to a 20-14 win. I just said Dan, I meant Dave Hampton. Had to look at it again when I said Dan Hampton. There's no way that's the same one I know of. Now, Foreman's playing time was going up and down in that stretch of game. He was ineffective at Cincinnati. The Bengals were on their way to a 10-4 season in a playoff spot where they would eventually lose 34-16 to the Miami Dolphins. And the Bengals embarrassed the Vikings 27-0. Minnesota bounced back to close out the year with easy wins over the Packers and the Giants, both by 31-7 scores and both on the road. Bryant intercepted 3 passes at Green Bay, including one taken to the house early in that game that set the tone. So now it's playoff time. And George Allen's over-the-hill gang, the Washington Redskins, were coming to the old Metropolitan Stadium on December the 22nd for the NFC Divisional Playoff round. An early turnover set up a Redskins touchdown, and Washington's Larry Brown, the league MVP 1 year earlier when the Skins reached the Super Bowl, ran for 115 yards. Minnesota trailed 7-3 early and 13-10 after 3 quarters. Now, the risk of another home playoff loss akin to the disappointments of 1970 and 71 was all of a sudden a very real possibility for the Vikings. But Tarkenton found Gilliam on a 28-yard touchdown pass to give the Vikings the lead. Then cornerback Nate Wright intercepted a pass and set up another Tarkenton to Gilliam touchdown. Washington scored to cut the lead back to 24-20, but Tarkenton led a final drive for a field goal. Minnesota eventually wins the game 27-20. Now, Minnesota would have to go to Dallas for the NFC Championship game. Like I said, the rules today, the Vikings would have been the number 1 seed in the playoffs. And Dallas was 10-4. Minnesota was 12-2. And actually, believe it or not, Dallas was favored in this game, probably more because of the home field advantage than anything else. And the defense for the Vikings came ready to play, and so did the running game. Foreman ran for 76, with Reed adding 75. Dallas running back Calvin Hill was out, and quarterback Roger Staubach couldn't carry the load all by himself against this great Vikings defense. Nonetheless, a punt return for a touchdown got Dallas back into the game after they fell behind 10-0. Tarkenton and Gilliam hooked up on a 54-yard touchdown pass, but it was still 17-10 when the Cowboys began driving and crossed midfield. Then Bobby Bryant steps up, intercepts Roger Staubach. It was one of 4 interceptions that the Dallas Cowboys would throw on the day. And on this one, Bryant finished it off in the end zone. The game was effectively over, and Minnesota won the game 27-10. It was going to the Super Bowl for the first time since 1969. Now, head coach Bud Grant took his team to the state of Texas for the Super Bowl. The game was held at Old Rice Stadium in Houston, and the Miami Dolphins were looking for a repeat title. And the Dolphins that day were simply too good for the Vikings. Tarkenton was able to complete 18 to 28 passes for 182 yards, but he couldn't find Gilliam on the big play, and the Vikings couldn't run the ball. Miami could. Miami piled up 136 rushing yards on the game and won easily 24-7. But still, the 1973 season was the start of some very good things in Minnesota Vikings football history. They never did win the Super Bowl, but this was the first of 3 NFC crowns in a 4-year stretch where the Vikings were the best team in the conference. So when you look at this Minnesota Vikings team, as a whole, maybe the greatest or one of the greatest teams to not win a Super Bowl. They lose the Super Bowl in 73. They lost in a championship game in 74. Or no, wait, let's see. They lost Super Bowl 8. They lost Super Bowl 9, but those were to the Dolphins, the Steelers, and then, of course, Super Bowl 11 to the Raiders, 3 of the greatest teams to ever grace the NFL. And when you look back on it, this was a legendary Vikings team with multiple Hall of Famers, an all-time great quarterback, and an all-time great head coach in Bud Grant, who, because of not winning the Super Bowls, doesn't get his just, rewards. I mean, he's one of the greatest coaches of all time. He won multiple Grey Cups with the Winnipeg Blue Bombers in the early 60s and the CFL. And this deserves to be remembered not as a near great team. This was a great team. They just fell short against 3 of the greatest teams to ever play the game. So on this day, December 30th, 1973, the Minnesota Vikings win the NFC Championship by beating the Dallas Cowboys. All right, guys, you can hear on this day every day on The Grueling Truth. You can follow us at Twitter, at Grueling Truth. Make sure you go to Spreaker to listen to the show every day. Also, you can find us anywhere else you find podcasts, including Spotify, iHeartRadio, iTunes, TuneIn, as we said, Spreaker, Stitcher, you name it, we're there. So, I will talk to you guys tomorrow when we do a little December the 31st. Don't know the year yet. You'll have to check back to see what the event was. So, for Mike Goodpastor, you've been listening to The Grueling Truth, where the legends speak.